Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. In today's episode, we are tackling something very exciting, a witch's hat. And not just any witch's hat, a Christmas witch's hat. I have a friend on Instagram named Nicholas Blackwood. He goes by the handle Lord Blackwood, and he makes the most incredible looking witch's hats. And I actually had him make me one in 2019, and it was so beautiful. I loved it so much. And I wanted to figure out how to make one myself. So that is what we're going to be tackling in this episode. And with that said, let's begin. To get things started, you'll want to take a measurement of the diameter of your head. And then I've got something called a wig block here, but you can actually use all sorts of things, anything that's essentially round, and you can just build up the shape because you really kind of want something sort of stable that you can build your hat on. Now, the art of hat making is called millinery, and I know so little about it, which I hope to change in the future. But in the meantime, I'm going to be using materials that I'm personally familiar and comfortable with, which is why we're starting this episode by using window screen mesh. The pros and cons I came across while working with this material, obviously the pros are it's dirt cheap. It's metal, so you can bend it into any shape you want, and it's really easy to cut. So it's incredibly easy to work with, it's inexpensive, and it will completely do the job you want. One of the drawbacks is it's metal, so whenever you cut it, you end up with like this frayed edge, and it can be a little uncomfortable. So we're obviously going to be ultimately covering that, but just something to keep in mind as you build this. Let me warn you about something really important here. You want to make sure this headband that you're creating is on the excessive side, so a little bit too big. And the reason for that is we're going to be adding layers of fabric inside and kind of bending it different ways. And you definitely don't want to create a custom hat that is too tight or uncomfortable when you wear it. So err on the roomier side. Now we're getting ready to build out the brim, and what we're going to do is lay down this headband on that. And something you want to keep in mind is your head is not perfectly round. It's kind of a little bit egg-shaped. So you do want to bend it a little bit so that it fits to your actual head. To ensure that the brim is perfectly symmetrical, I'm only drawing half of it, and then I'm going to fold it over and then cut it out from there. To create a lot of flexibility and also stability, we're going to be double layering this brim. One layer will be the cardstock that you just saw, and the next layer will be this mesh layer. And as you can see in the center, I've left about a 1/2 inch allowance. And the reason you want to definitely do that is we're going to actually be using that to connect it to the headband that we created. These are little relief cuts that I'm cutting into that allowance that I just mentioned, and we'll be just flipping these up and bending them into little tabs that will connect to the headband. On the screen layer, you also want to leave an exterior allowance out on that outer brim of about a 1/2 inch, and later we'll be covering why we did that. Oh my gosh, when you're working with hot glue, always wear either gardening gloves or dishwashing gloves, because I cannot tell you how many times I have dropped like a glop of hot glue on my finger and actually burned myself. And it's horrible to do that. The reason gardening gloves or dishwashing gloves are great is because they're not as thick as, working gloves, which are really kind of hard to maneuver. But they're definitely thick enough that they protect you from burning yourself, which is obviously ideal. We're now ready to affix the headband to the brim, and the way I'm going to do this is apply a very thin sort of line right here on the edge, let it sit down and rest and become really stable. And then once we've done that, we can go and bend those little tabs that we made, apply a little bit of glue to really either side, and then just squeeze that with your fingers, and that will kind of meld them together. Now it's already starting to look pretty cute, but something to keep in mind is there's a lot of metal poking around, and it's it's gonna grab all of your hair as you try it on. So something to keep in mind. What I'm doing here is creating some relief cuts just on this inner brim. And what I'm going to be doing is bending it in, creating a little bit more of a three-dimensional shape, which will fit more naturally on your head. Once that was done, it was time to actually cut into this headband, fold that over and glue it. And what this will ultimately achieve is it just creates the foundation for the shape that we ultimately want. Now you can leave the brim completely flat, and that is pretty traditional, but because I want to create a really kind of dramatic silhouette with mine, I'm going to be making cuts into the brim and inserting these little pie slices, and you'll see what that achieves. If you do decide to tackle this technique that I'm featuring right here, just keep in mind there's really no right or wrong way to do it. I'm making mine pretty dramatic, but if you want to play it a little more safe, you can just do 2 slices, one in the front and one in the back. But I'm really kind of going all out on this, and so that's why I'm adding 4. You'll want to start by gluing down one side of the pie slice right along that cut that you made. And then once you've done that, underneath you can actually slide that cut apart as far as you want. And then once you find a spacing that you're happy with, glue down the other side. At this point, you really kind of begin to get a sense of how this brim is going to fit on your head, and you can kind of mold it into the shape that you desire. Once we've done that, we're just going to take some additional pie slices of screen and glue them in. And then once we've done that, we can address this brim. And how we're going to do that is that allowance that we left, we're going to take a wire and glue that in just along the edge, and then flip that allowance down and glue that on. And what that will do is make this brim completely moldable into any shape you like. And now is a really fun part. We're actually going to start building that classic conical shape of a witch's hat. This is a part that, again, has a lot of different ways to achieve the same look. But the way that I found that works really great is cutting strips and gluing one side, bringing it around, and just kind of shifting it into the shape that I wanted per strip, gluing and then cutting each like excess little bit out of the way. Once you've built up a decent amount, feel free to start cutting in and making pretty much what are darts into the shape of the hat. So if it's a little too bulky or you want it to curve in any which way, just take a big slice and start folding those over and gluing them. To ensure that the shape is going really well, make sure to have a mirror handy and keep trying it on so you can keep track of the progress. Once you get up to a certain height, you don't have to keep wrapping it around. You can take what are essentially 2 pizza slices of that screen, glue them to either side, and then mold them together until you end up with a really clean point. At this stage, that screen is extremely prickly, so you'll be jazzed that you're wearing gloves. It's looking a little too tall for me, so I'm going to take it off, make another one of those dart cuts, and just keep molding it until it is a silhouette that I'm super happy with. a little added control, I'm just taking a wire, inserting it right here, and then gluing it into place. Now it's time to dye our fabric. Now, I've dyed fabric a million times in these episodes, so I'm going to keep this segment kind of brief, but I will mention that I once again used synthetic fabric because it was the prettiest. And once again, I've almost lost my sanity trying to shade it and color it. So in the future, either use natural fibers, or if you're going to use something synthetic, try to find it as close to the color as you want and maybe just tint it a little bit, because it is a bit, it's a struggle. Once I'm done mixing the color into the shade that I'm happy with, I always do a test strip to make sure I like it. Once I've gotten to that stage, I fill up a sink with a lot of detergent and I wash the fabric I'm going to be dyeing before placing it into the dye bath. After a decent amount of frustration, I ultimately was very happy with how they came out, and I was then ready to start applying the fabrics to the hat. Initially, I thought I was going to be able to hand sew all of this together, and then I realized that this fabric is like this dense micro suede, and it's difficult to sort of work a needle through, and it's a nightmare on your fingers. And so now I'm going to be using hot glue. The big difference between, using thread or glue is thread is really forgiving. If you end up with something that you're not happy with, you just cut the thread and redo it. Glue is a little more binding, and it can sometimes damage the fabric that you're working with. So just keep that in mind. That's the big difference between the two techniques, and that's why I'm using hot glue. I wanted these layers to look like they were almost braided together. So to achieve that, I would just take a strip, fold over an edge, and then glue down one side, bring it around, and then glue down the other, obviously snipping away any excess fabric that I didn't need. And after multiple layers, you could really kind of see that pattern developing. Something nice I can tell you is at the top, like the peak of this hat, is when it's really difficult to begin. But once you get down to this stage, the layers start obviously becoming bigger and they're much more easy to manage. Once your hat is starting to resemble a gorgeous stalk of asparagus and you're down there at the bottom, you can start just trimming away the excess and then just applying little individual pieces to those exposed bits of mesh. All right, so because I distorted the shape or the surface of this brim, it's no longer a flat surface, and I've been trying to make this material sort of lay flat on it, but there's no stretch at all to this. So because of that, I'm going to attempt a layering method. Now, in the future, if I were to do this again, if you distort the shape of that brim, you probably want to use a material that has like a little bit of stretchiness or is just a little bit more forgiving. Another really helpful tip I can share with you is definitely err on the side of too little glue, because if you use a bigger glob, it can sometimes actually work its way through the fabric or seep out of an edge, and you definitely don't want to do that. Once you've made your way all the way around the brim and you're coming back to where you started, that last little layer, as you put that down, you can actually peel up the first layer that you put down and then put that down over it, and that will just make the whole thing seamless. Once you've spent a little time working out any bumps and making sure those top layers are perfectly smooth, you can actually begin flipping this over and gluing it just down there on the edge. And I found it was really helpful to start at one point and duplicate that move all the way around the brim and then come back and just do step by step by step, so it all looked really uniform. To ensure that none of the frayed edges of the screen sort of poked my head, I did 2 protective layers here on the inside before I installed that final lining underneath. I'm using a dark emerald velvet to line the inside, and luckily there was a decent amount of give or stretchiness to this, so I was able to install this in just one solid piece. Before doing any actual sewing, I pinned everything into place so that I could ensure that there was no sort of wrinkles or pulls anywhere that I didn't want them. Depending on the surface you're working on, sometimes a curved needle is incredibly helpful when hand stitching something. So whenever I need something like that, I just take a standard sewing needle and 2 pairs of pliers and just kind of curve it using that technique. And it can just sometimes make a job go a whole lot easier. I dyed this wedding lace that I found at Joann Fabric, and it had these beautiful flowers on it that I just felt like it would just pop so much on this hat if those flowers were red. So I grabbed a few different colors of red and just went around and hand embroidered over this machine embroidery. I then trimmed out those pieces and left a little tiny bit of an allowance all the way around, and then just hand stitched that onto that dark velvet underlining. All right, we're finally to the stage where we're going to make our belt for our hat, which means it's time to break out those buckles we made in the last episode. I wanted the end of my belt to have a fairly dramatic flare, so I decided to sketch it out first, and then I could just cut that out and actually use that as a pattern on the fabric. I used a measuring tape to figure out the diameter of that headband on the outside of the hat, and then I laid that down and I gave myself an additional 5 inches to work with. Once I was done cutting out one side, I laid that on another piece of fabric, pinned it down, and then I was ready to start sewing those pieces together. You don't necessarily want to cut out that second piece yet, just in case any of the fabric moves around while you're sewing. I've decided to give this hat a layered belt effect, so I needed to create a secondary belt. This one's going to be red, and it's going to be a little bit larger than that green belt. It took a little time to flip these belts inside out, but once I had done that, I smoothed them as much as I could with my hands, and then I just took an iron and pressed them flat. To get everything to lay just right, I stitched all of the pieces together so that they couldn't shift or move around. And then even on the back side, I really needed it to curve upward once it was laying flat on the hat. And so I just took this little gathered dart, pulled it over, and stitched it in place. From there, I began sewing it directly onto the hat. And this, took some elbow grease. And at one point, I just had to get the pliers involved because it was so tough to get through. So the way the belt came across the back, it was just going to sort of trail off the edge, and I needed it to actually wrap around. So a fun little workaround I came up with was to create a pretty elegant looking kind of fold on the back. And it wasn't something I had planned, but it ultimately ended up, I think, improving the look of the hat. So sometimes you can end up with what you think is going to be a mistake or something that you have to cover up, and it ends up just actually enhancing the finished look of what you're making. To ensure that those points that I created here on the belt laid perfectly flat, I did an invisible stitch through the back and just didn't pierce through that front fabric. And so it still looked perfect, but it wasn't going to move anywhere. Now, something I didn't quite capture here is, and it's really important, is if you're gathering something in a circle, the best way you can do this is to take your circle, fold it exactly in half, fold it in half once again, and now you'll find that you have 4 points. Use some pins to mark those, and then lay it down and pin each of those 4 points into your circle. And then find the middle point in between each of those, make another pin. So you've got a total of 8 pins now at this point. Do that once again, so double it up, 16 pins. And once you've done that, you're kind of going to have the right amount of fabric in each area. And this is really helpful in making the whole thing look really uniform, so you don't end up with too much gathering or too little on either end. We now get to attach Pancake to the brim, and I'm going to do this by drilling 2 little holes on either side towards the top and towards the bottom and working a wire through. My initial plan for how I was going to do this wasn't really working, and thankfully the captive got involved and figured out this technique of looping in the wire and creating 2 loops on each side, and it just looked so great, so it made my job a lot easier. I then threaded through 4 needles, and from there placed Pancake right on the brim where I wanted him, and took each of those needles right kind of where their loop was going to be and poked it through underneath just so I could make sure it was going to come out in the right spot. Once I had done that, I was able to move Pancake out of the way, pull those through, and then lay Pancake back down, work those needles directly through those hoops, pull them back down, and this way You're not kind of just like fishing around with a needle and potentially damaging what you've created. Once this prince was looking and feeling very secure on his little spot, I knotted those threads underneath to make sure that they weren't going to be going anywhere. After that, as a final touch to sort of tie this whole project together, I took some of those embroidered pieces that I had installed on the bottom lining and then just affixed them up to the top of the belt just to kind of tie the whole thing together. Gosh, how neat did this come out? I love it so much, and I feel like it's completely ready for its own midnight broom ride. And Pancake has a very happy little spot here just on the brim. Once again, a huge thank you to Nicholas Blackwood for inspiring me with the beautiful hats that he makes. I completely want to learn everything there is to know about millinery now because it's just so much fun. Let me know if you like this episode because I really would like to make more hat episodes in the future. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in. Take care of yourselves and have a very Merry Christmas.